Our speaker tonight, I think we have a real treat. Donna Donnell. She's a Fort Worth native. She's been a long time in genealogy. She has a lot of expertise and a lot of stories that she can tell us, but her interest got started when her son was ill, and she decided, the doctors were asking about family history, and she decided she'd better get into the genealogy of her family and look for medical issues, and that's another very important reason why people do need to do their genealogy. The bug caught, she became infected with the bug, and she's been at it for over 40 years. And she told me to tell you she started when she was very young. But her emphasis has been on Western history. She loves the Fort Worth history, especially the Wild Bunch, the Edda Place. She has debunked some myths about what was going on in Fort Worth at the time. She's just done a lot of research on this area. And along the way, she found out about the Swartz Brothers, who, as you know, one of the brothers took the very famous, iconic photo of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the Wild Bunch here in Fort Worth. It's become the icon of that era. So she's going to tell us a little bit tonight about her journey with the Swartz Brothers and how that ended up being a genealogical family study. So please help me welcome Donna Donnell.
As Debbie said, I'm Donna Donnell, and I'm a genealogist, and I've been addicted to it for 40 years, and I understand this is a 12-step program. Am I right? And I'm glad to be here, and I hope I can get rid of the addiction by the time I leave. I am a Fort Worth native. I did start when I was very young, in my early 20s, and yes, it was for medical history, but also I had grown up here in Fort Worth, hearing from my dad about things that went on with Fort Worth historical-wise, and from my grandmother, and especially from my great-aunt Frucy, who was Tennessee Southern Belle that came here to Fort Worth right after the Civil War. So when I started genealogy for family health issues, I also found it was a great combination on my love for history, and so it just evolved over the last 40 years. So we're kind of limited on time, and so we'll get the show started. I'm gonna get comfortable here, and so we're going to talk about the Swartz Brothers, and we're going to talk about why I decided to. Sometimes I call myself an investigator. Not necessarily a genealogist, but an investigator, because I'm not really looking for a crime, but sometimes by the time I finish it is a crime. And why did I do this? Well, the reason why I did this is this picture that was taken November 21st, 1900, known locally as the Fort Worth Five, and nationally or internationally known as the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So I was staring 4 years ago at this photograph on my computer, and I had looked at it, and it's a remarkable photograph. It jumps out at you. It's almost three-dimensional. But then I realized I was looking through the eyes of the photographer. I wasn't looking through my eyes. This is what John Schwartz was looking at. And so I felt a connection to him, as when we get into genealogy and we connect to our family members, and I had that connection with him. But no one knew, or no one ever bothered to look up and see what happened to John Schwartz after he made this photograph. And today you can buy t-shirts, coffee mugs, all sorts of things with this photograph on it. It's been published in thousands of magazine articles, newspapers, and books. So people are profiting off of it. So what happened to John Schwartz? So I decided I'd check and see where. I knew he no longer lived in Fort Worth. I knew that at some point in time he left. And so that was my goal, is to find out what happened to him after he left, after this photograph was taken. So the search was on. I used some of the resources I used was Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, genealogybank.com, newspaperarchive.com, and forgive my spelling. Google.com, of course, just the general search. I love Google Books. If you don't use Google Books, it's free. There is a lot of information, and you would be totally surprised what's on that site. And of course, Yahoo. Along with that, I used just what all of us genealogies do. I went after probate records, marriage records, death certificates, of course, census records, just about anything I could find. So, right after I decided I was going to start searching for John, on one of my general engine searches, I came up with a 13-year-old posting. And to us genealogists, someone posting something for a search 13 years ago, when you're dealing with centuries, 13 years isn't that long, it's like yesterday. And so what happened was there was a post and a small genealogy of the Schwartz family on the internet, and it was written by Tom Williams, who stated that he was his grandfather. All he knew of his grandfather was that he was a photographer in Fort Worth. That was it. So I took a chance on the email address, shot him an email, and it was, I think the title was, "Do you know who your grandfather was?" And so I told him about the photograph of the Wild Bunch. And he came back and said, "No, I did not." He said, "I've seen that photograph 100 times. And he said, "I did not know that was my grandfather that took that photograph." So thus began a 4-year relationship, which has gone on even past that now, between Tom Williams and I in trying to find the family of John, and it became also the 2 other brothers, and my goal was to reunite them. And so I did the general, what we do in genealogy, went to the census, found where John and David and Charlie were born, which was outside of Mount Jackson, Shenandoah County, Virginia. The Swartz were farmers, and they also ran a mill. This is just a common mill, probably similar to what the Schwartz had on the family farm. Their father, Peter Philip Schwartz, owned no slaves. He didn't have to. He had 11 children to do the labor. Back up here. So, Philip Peter Schwartz was born in 1872 and died in 1892. He was a farmer all of his life in Shenandoah County. He married Susan Coop, who also was born in 1817 and died in 1875. Here's David Schwartz. This is the only photograph of a photographer. And it's really not a photograph, it's a self-sketched image done by David Schwartz. David was born in 1854, died in 1918. He left the farm shortly in the 1870s and moved with a lot of people, had migrated from the Virginia area into Pennsylvania, Ohio, the industrial area, because the South was so damaged from the Civil War that money was scarce. And also it seems that he probably had a little bit of wanting to not be a farmer and find something more exciting. So he ended up in Ohio, working in a mill in Ohio, the same thing he was doing at the farm. For some reason, he came across one Nellie Barnum, who was herself the daughter of a photographer, photography enthusiast. Her father was a spiritualist and believed in the early days, as many did, photographs captured your spirit. And so Nellie is the reason why all these guys turned out to be photographers. I call it for the love of a woman. So David and Nellie ran off together. I found them in the 1880 census, unmarried, both photographers, staying in a hotel in Cleburne, Texas. And what they probably did, like a lot of photographers at the time, was they rode the rails. They would take photographs, they'd stop in little towns and take photographs of the people, and then move on. Take the next train to the next stop, and then move on. Stay for a few days, stay for a few weeks, stay for a few months. And so they ended up, 1880, they were in Cleburne, Texas. And by 1881, they were in Colorado County, Texas, South Texas. And David had set up gone into partnership with another photographer. And so he said he went into the professional studio business. They had one child, Minnie, in 1881, and she died a few months after she was born. And we run into that a lot in genealogy when we're researching our families. The death of a child, the early death of a child, be it from typhoid or pneumonia or any other type of disease or infection, because they didn't have antibiotics at the time. So they stayed down in Columbus, Texas, and took photographs all over of the local people. David wasn't very good. He was learning his craft, and he really was a lousy photographer. But by the time he had arrived in Fort Worth in 1885, his skills were a little bit better. He preferred, actually, he did a lot of sketches as opposed to photography. I really think he preferred to, as he says on this, any picture furnished in crayon, pencil, oil. He really preferred to be an artist, and he called himself an artist. This is 1886. John Schwartz, his brother John, arrives on the scene here in Fort Worth. This is the only known photograph of John Schwartz. Not a very good one, but it's taken out of the Fort Worth newspaper. And John was born in 1859 and died in 1937. John, as I mentioned, arrived in 1886 and was an apprentice to his brother David at David's studio. They did very, very well. A lot of the photographs we see that were taken by David Schwartz, a lot of them were probably taken by John. He was just learning the craft. It was David's studio. So he would not become a partner when it would still be D.H. or David Schwartz and brother. So after hanging around Fort Worth for 10 years, John headed up to Denison. And oddly enough, John partnered in Denison, Texas with the same partner that David had in Columbus, Texas. But that didn't last very long either. And then John went out on his own and established a business and stayed in Denison for a few years. And then Charlie Swartz, born in Shenandoah County, 1864 during the Civil War, and died in 1905 here in Fort Worth. Charlie came into the partnership with David after John had left. So Charlie arrived about 1895. Prior to that, he was selling sewing machines in Mount Jackson, Virginia. Probably not making a lot of money, and going into the photography business sounded a little bit better. So Charlie comes into Fort Worth in 1895. Here's an early picture of Fort Worth to kind of tell you how rugged it was. This was taken by John Schwartz in 1888. pretty dusty, ugly prairie town. In 1896, John Schwartz met and married schoolmarm Lydia Blanche Buck in Denison, Texas. She was the daughter of George Buck. Interesting that George Buck was the engineer on the train that took President Abraham Lincoln's body cross country for his burial in Springfield, Illinois. Here's Lydia, and you can definitely see why John Schwartz would have been attracted to her. For the time in the day, she was very pretty. And these are all Schwartz photographs. These were taken by John. Now we're going to get into the family. This is Bessie Schwartz, John and Lydia's daughter. And this is Tom Williams' mother. And she was just a few months old when this was taken, and it was taken by her daddy. And this is Orpha Clara Davis Buck, Lydia's mother, and granddaughter Bessie. And this is 1908, taken here in Fort Worth by John Schwartz. And the reason why I'm including photographs is photographs are becoming more and more popular in doing genealogy. And this is a fine example, even though this family was a family of photographers, there are very few photographs that they have. There's no doubt that the Swartz brothers took a lot of photographs of their family, but only a handful remain. I just had been salivating. I'll give you an example. I was salivating for years, decades, to get my grandmother and great-grandmother's photographs from my aunt. And I just here in the last year received those. My aunt passed away, Aunt Leava passed away several years ago. And my, my cousin asked me to come to the house and pick up the photographs. I broke out in tears. Now, Aunt Leava, I loved her to death, but I picked up paper dolls. If she didn't like you, you got cut out of the photograph. If she got mad at you, you got cut out of the photographs. And if any of y'all have those photograph albums with the black paper that your photographs were pasted with that, remember the cement glue? Don't try and take them off. Your scanner, you can scan them in your scanner and you can scan multiple photographs. And then they will be separated. But Leava had decided she was also going to cut those out. And sometimes she cut them out with the, you know, the raggedy sewing scissors. Yeah. Sometimes she messed, and then she glued multiple little photographs onto postcards. It's just a mess, and it was heartbreaking, but photographs are something we need to take very, very good care of. And we need to make sure that who we pass them on to, that they're going to take care of them, or so on. Or we can call Betty and donate them to the Fort Worth Library. Here's another picture, Lydia Buck Schwartz, and this is her son George Landis Schwartz. And again, you can see the craft work in John's work. John was just a fascinating photographer. I can tell his picture from the other brothers. This is George Buck, and he worked for the railroad, and he was brought down here and by the railroad, and that's what he was doing, living in Denison. And later he got into the oil business and lived in Mexico for a while, and then the family later moved out to Los Angeles, California area. Now, this is an interesting picture because this is Orpha Buck, Lydia's mother. Love the hat, don't you? Well, in doing research, what I did was I found out so much about the family and what they did, and that hat may very well have been made by Lydia. I found an old fair article in the Fort Worth on Genealogy Bank, where it was advertising that Lydia Blanche Buck was going to be the fair's haberdasher in the women's department. So one of the things she did along with poetry was Lydia made hats. I would like to think this might be an advertisement. This is Charlie Schwartz and his son Charlie Jr. And this is an amazing photograph. And this was probably taken shortly before Charlie was killed by the Katy, was killed by the train in October 1905. He was setting up his tripod and his camera to take a photograph of a new building. And he was out cutting, I don't know if you've heard the story, he was out chopping down the weeds when he heard the train coming. And not only was the camera his livelihood, but the camera was also his baby. And he did what any father would do for their child. He ran out to save the camera, and he was hit and killed by the train. And this is, like I said, this photograph was probably taken shortly before it happened. And you can see just great, it's just fantastic. I don't know if Charlie took this, he probably did, and probably used some sort of delayed mechanism to get this photograph done. And so the story of the Swartz family really begins with Charlie's death. It was a very close-knit family, like many were at the time, and maybe more so. Even though they competed against each other in photographic competition, it was done with politeness. So Charlie's death was a great tragedy. When he died, I found in a newspaper article from Woodstock, Virginia, that his wife, Ginny, and the children were actually back home in Virginia visiting relatives when Ginny received a telegram stating that Charlie had been killed. They did not return back to Fort Worth. They stayed in Virginia. And John and David took care of the estate and their personal belongings. One thing that John did was Charlie had won the gold medal in photography one year in Fort Worth, in the state of Texas, by the Texas Photographer Association. Diane was telling me that gold medal she remembers seeing as a child and playing with it, and it was to go to her older brother. Well, when the Swartz family farm was sold and torn down some years ago, Diane's brother did not go up to the attic and clean it out. So the gold medal and family photographs were lost. Again, that's important. Clean out the attic, clean out the basement, and make sure that everything that has to do with your family is in a secure location, and make sure you remember where it's at. So what happened was John was appointed by the court to handle the estate, and I just recently got the probate records, and there were 221 pages. And these people didn't have money, but they had 221 pages of probate records dating from 1907 to 1925. And John leased out Charlie's studio for income for the widow and the two children. He leased out their home. He bought with the settlement money of $1,000 from the railroad. They paid $1,000 in damages, and he bought for a little over $900 a house over the north side, and he rented that. And with that, there was a monthly income that was sent to the widow and to the children back in Virginia. Sadly, Ginny never recovered from the loss, and Ginny ended up having a nervous breakdown and ended up in the state hospital in Staunton, Virginia, and that's where she remained. So the children went to live with one of the brothers at the family farm where they stayed. And Lemuel Swartz took care of them via John sending them monthly money for buying clothes, food, and whatever else they needed. This is Louise May Swartz, Charlie Swartz's daughter. This is Diane Rowley, who came to Fort Worth. This is her mother. They never, as I said, they never came back to Fort Worth, so they really didn't have a lot of connection with the family or what Diane knew. Diane knew very little. She thought that they had just been abandoned by the other two brothers here in Fort Worth. And this is Ginny Hagi Schwartz. As I said, she ended up, she went to the State Mental Hospital as early as 1908 that I can find. I found her in the 1910 census, listed in the census State Mental Hospital. It was a hard find to find what happened to Ginny. They managed to, she went by Virginia, she went by Helen, Schwartz would be misspelled, and then finally I found her in the State Mental Hospital in 1910, but I couldn't find her in 1920. I couldn't find any death mentioned on her. She wasn't buried in the, or that I could find in the cemetery where the other Swartz family members are buried at in Mount Jackson. So it really threw me for a loop until the probate records. When I got those, there was a note by John reporting to the court that Ginny had passed away in 1916. And my next, since I just recently found that out, my next is to send to the state of Virginia for her death certificate. And I'll find out where she's buried and hopefully be able to tell Diane a little bit more about her grandmother. This is one of the things that Diane had. This is one of Charlie Swartz's business cards. And notice it said Goodnight Buffaloes. Well, I looked that up. I thought, well, what on earth is Goodnight Buffaloes? Is it, is it a song? Is it what? But Charles Goodnight, I learned, you learn a little bit new stuff out of this. Charles Goodnight was one of the first buffalo and bison preservationists, and so these were his Goodnight buffaloes that he was keeping on his ranches in Texas and in New Mexico. That was a unique find. And his book, he had views of Fort Worth, which the Fort Worth Library has here, and they're wonderful. It's a little bitty pamphlet, but great photographs of some of Fort Worth's old landmarks that we no longer have here. One of the things that I got through Diane, and these are important in doing our genealogy too, letters, postcards, Christmas cards. You know how don't throw those Christmas cards away, they tell you something. Well, these are some of the postcards that when Charlie Jr. was older, he became, Diane said, a gypsy, and he left Virginia. Well, what he did was he came back to Fort Worth. Once he became Fort Worth and Dallas, and he stayed both with John and with his Uncle David. And these are photographs that, some of these are from Dallas, that he sent back home to May Louise. And they are the sweetest photographs. My loving baby sister, you don't remember much because you were a little girl then, and it was always love your brother. And so these are just remarkable that Diane still has these, but apparently her mother kept them all. Kept all the postcards that Charlie sent her, no matter, and he traveled all over the country. And he finally came back here. He was at, when he turned of age, he came back here and signed the probate records and got a few $100s in cash, which was a lot in the 20s. along with the property, which he and his sister sold. So they had a little bit of a nest egg. Thanks to John, their Uncle John. And when I gave Diane copies of the probate records and she read them, that she said that she was completely surprised of the contact that the family still maintained with the children, and the concern that both John and David had about the children long after Charlie had been killed and long after their mother had died. Their priority was to make sure those children were taken care of. Tom was totally amazed that his grandfather had taken such good care and such thought in taking care of his nieces and nephews. And here's some more of the postcards. She sent me a lot. It's just fascinating to read, and you can kind of feel what he was feeling when he came back to Fort Worth. Fort Worth was his life. Fort Worth was the good times. Fort Worth, both of his parents were in good health. Everything was happy in Fort Worth, and so you can read in his letters that he sends home when he came back here, he was hoping to find that. Sadly, he didn't. Now, this is May 10th, and we had, for the Schwartz photo exhibit, we had a reception. This is the first time, this is Tom Williams, John Schwartz's grandson. This is Diane Riley, Charlie Schwartz's granddaughter. This is the first time that family had been together in over a year. They didn't know the other existed, but they were looking for each other. And how I found them, which I think is what y'all want to know, is I used every resource I could. I mean, you know, I went to every phone book. I went online. Obituaries online. Genealogy Bank is I think my primary resource for finding lost relatives because the obituaries go back so far. And from those obituaries I get children's names, grandchildren's names, and then I go looking for them. And I will say, over the years, not doing just their research, but other research in my own, I've never been hung up on when I have called people. No one has hung up on me. I don't know why, but they haven't. No one has not answered my email. It's just most people have a need to know where they came from, because that makes them who they are. And this was, I think, one of the most rewarding experiences in my entire life was bringing this family together. They deserved it. They were lost. This is myself and Tom and Diane, and on Saturday the 11th we put a marker on Charlie Swartz's grave. And so it was the first time that Charlie had been with his granddaughter. It was extremely moving, emotional, and happy that we could do this. Oddly enough, on the way up here, Tom and his family stopped off to have lunch. And they stopped at a steakhouse, and I believe this is outside of Waco. Oddly enough, there's his grandfather. So, of course, great photo op. Now, we had lunch Saturday. You missed this. We had lunch Saturday, the Swartz family and I, down here at Risky's downtown. Well, when I walked in, we had about 8 Elvi. They're not Elvises, they're Elvi, plural. They're at Risky's, and I walk in, and the Swartz families all having photographs taken with Elvis. And they said, "Oh my Lord, does Fort Worth really know how to roll out the red carpet? Donna, this is great, thank you." Tom Williams runs into his grandfather. This is what I'm telling you, it's all over the place. Who is John Schwartz? And this was downtown at Sundance Square. And so he finally, as he said, I finally got to have a photo taken with my grandpappy. And so here he is, and it was, the family are still in contact with each other. They now have a Schwartz internet newsletter, Schwartz family internet newsletter. Diane and Tom are still in contact. They're in contact with, I found another Schwartz descendant of John's in Los Angeles. He's a California firefighter. And Diane's brother is still living, and he lives right down from the family, what used to be the family farm. So in the end, what I did was I took on the Swartz family as my family. I did exactly what I would do, looked furiously fast, hard, long, to connect, and which I did, and got them together, was able to fill in a lot of blanks that they had about their own family, and doing it from not just a genealogical standpoint, but also through historical, and just plain curious. I guess. And so that was pretty much how it went. I'm an official member of the Swartz family, and John Schwartz ended up, the end result was, to finalize this as to why I started this. John hung around the Fort Worth, North Texas area, moving all over, Denton, Sulphur Springs, back to Fort Worth, always coming back to Fort Worth. And then as his health failed him, he moved back to the Swartz family farm outside of Mount Jackson, Virginia. And when his brother Lemuel passed away, he moved up to Manassas, Virginia, and lived with a niece who took care of him. And he died in 1937. Now in 1938 was when one of the first books on the Wild Bunch came out that opened up the door to the photograph, and the photograph was in the book and on the cover, and it was called The Outlaw Trail by Charles Kelley. No one over the years who has written books have ever tried to contact this family. No one. When Charles Kelley was writing his book, John Schwartz was very much alive. He could have answered a lot of the questions that we have today as to what was said. John, what do you remember about that day? But John never mentioned it in anything at all. It was just a day's work and probably a day's 50 cents for the photograph. And so when he died, an old, broke man back home where he came from. So I guess, is there any questions y'all might?
Is it true that the picture was, be careful, you may scream.
Oh.
The picture was in a window and
No.
That's not
No,
true?
no. I found in some Old Fort Worth newspaper articles, it was just myth. First of all, John Schwartz's studio, and I should have brought a photograph of it, was actually, his studio was on the second floor of the building. Sheehan's Saloon was downstairs. But when John came into that business, there at 705 Main and a Half, there was no bar downstairs. It was the city meat market. So it was a respectable building initially. I really don't think John would have been advertising downstairs in Sheehan's bar, because he took pictures of families, children, and respectable people. And you did not go up through the bar to get to his studio. There was a side side stairway outside. No, so you couldn't have been walking by and looked up, and the photographs are not that big. I mean, no, that's just myth. Fred Dodge never he wrote his memoirs. He's been one of those that saw it. Fred Dodge never wrote it in his detailed memoirs and diaries, and he would have mentioned that. Also, I found an article in Old Fort Worth newspaper right after they had captured, I think it was Carver, or Kilpatrick maybe, where in the article the local reporters said, you remember that we had a Fort Worth detective that was walking around town shortly after they left town with that photograph, and he was carrying it in his pocket, and he was asking people if they knew them. And the reason why he was asking is he would have recognized not Butch Cassidy, not the Sundance Kid. They'd never been in Texas. Nobody knew who they were, but they did know Bill Kilpatrick and Carver. And they knew them because they were from Texas, and they hung out in Texas, and they did a lot of crimes in Texas. And this Fort Worth detective, and God, Charles, it just went through my head. His brother had just been robbed by one of them. So there was a personal vendetta, but also John Schwartz was doing mugshots for the Fort Worth Police Department. Huh. So if they would pick somebody up in Hell's Half Acre, I moved.
That's all right.
Hell's Half Acre, they were doing what they called the rogue gallery. They would take them down to a local photographer, and that photographer made extra money making these mugshots, and they had books and books and books and books of these mugshots, which in most towns were thrown in the garbage years ago. And so no, that did not happen.
Well, how did it get known that that was his photo? Was it on the photo, Schwartz?
What they did not recognize, yes, because we really believe that this Fort Worth police detective, from all that the articles state, and what I had also found, Thornton, who was VP of the Pinkertons at the time, also attributed to it. To this Fort Worth police officer, Fort Worth detective, that was what busted open the case, was that photograph. So what we believe is that when he came in to do mug shots, that yes, that photograph, you can see in some of these photographs of the studio, they've got a lot of cabinet cards that they had taken as advertising. So we do think that yes, it was up there, but it was up in his studio, inside the studio, and then it was seen there by local authorities. And it was either that they recognized Carver or Kilpatrick, and not Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Those postcards you showed said postcard. Now, were those photographs, in fact, are printed? What was on the other side of those four?
She hasn't sent me those yet. She just scanned those in. We were doing this quickly, and she just scanned those in. And so I'm waiting to get what's on the reverse side of those photographs.
He had made postcards, they were actually photographs that were printed, and he just printed that other stuff on the back.
Right. You know, some of them were from Dallas, some of them were from California. Charlie Jr. died at the state hospital in Wichita Falls. I think that's why I got attached. It was just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. That when Charlie died, everything just fell apart. Just fell apart. He was the link to the chain.
You mentioned the $1,000 settlement from the railroad.
Yeah.
Did they do that frequently, or was that because
you sued? It was, yeah, you had to sue, and it took from 1905 to 1907 to get it, but yeah, you had to sue in civil court for damages. And of course, $1,000 to us isn't much, but when you can buy a house for $900, that was a lot of money back then. It wasn't enough for the children to live forever, but that was what happened.
Do you have any hints I have lots of pictures. Some old big fat cloth albums of pictures, you know. Some of them I knew, recognized. Others I can't figure out. But if you can read the studio, is there some common boneyard for photographers where their stuff goes when they go out of business?
What happened was, what I learned, there are some, and I'm going to tell you where they came from, where the Swartz Brothers came from. They had this photographer there that kept every single one of his glass slides. They've got tens of thousands. In this little bitty town, they have, they now archive them, and they have a lot of them online on this beautiful website. But what they did was, on those glass negatives, they recycled them. They would send them back when they needed new ones, send them back, and they would get a discount on the new ones that come in, and then what would happen is they would crush the glass and then redo them. Charlie's studio was sold in its states with glasses and lenses, but most of them had to be extremely frugal in what they did, and so they recycled them. Or they just got thrown out in the garbage.
There's still a lot around. I know that we're Fort Worth Camera Club too, and Eamon Carter has got a lot of photography, and they've got photographs that they acquired from photographers in Kansas, that people coming from the South, and especially blacks escaping the South, would go up there and they would have photographs taken and stuff. But they have a lot of from small photography places.
Photography collection.
They know who they're of.
Some they do and some they don't. They know who they got a whole collection on the stuff from Kansas, and they have names on some, and they don't have names on others. So, it was kind of a hit and miss.
So probably every city of any kind,
I would think
they're all
so.
going to be, somebody different is going to have those.
Well, for example, there's a book here called Chasing Shadows. That is all about early Texas photographers. Doesn't have any photographs in it, but it's Chasing Shadows. And you can go in and what it tells you is the photographer's name in all the places that thus far had been found where he set up shop, and from what years to what years, and if he moved someplace else, it'd have that from what years to what years. But a lot of cities these days, old photographs, preservation is becoming finally very, very, very popular. A lot of libraries, a lot of universities, a lot of archives are now collecting those. And I found Schwartz photographs all over the country, in archives and libraries all over the country. So
the price is really rising on them.
and I know I shot myself in the foot. I can't afford to buy them anymore.
There is
But
a website, I can't remember the name of it, but there is a website that collects photographs
Yeah, I've
from
heard of
all
it too.
over
I can't think
everywhere
of it.
and indicates who they are. And
there are a lot of websites. There are a lot of old photography websites. All you have to do is type in antique photography, cabinet cards, whatever type of photograph you're looking for. And if you type in, if you know what the photographer's name is, and you type in the photographer, you'll find something on Google. You'll find something on him. It's just, it's becoming a fascinating collection. An art collector bought the last one of these that was on sale for $85,000. She's a Canadian art collector, not a photograph collector, an art collector, because she knew exactly what that was. That's art. And so that's how it is. It's the game. But connecting those photographs with your family is very, very important. You don't see them in the earlier books that were printed in family history. So whatever you've got, whatever you can scrounge. And if I found someone's name written on the back of a Schwartz photograph, I went and looked to see if I could find them. Sometimes I found them. Sometimes I found descendants of that person, and I also reunited them with that photograph, a digital copy. I keep my originals, but I do, if I buy an old photograph and it's got a name, I look for it. So I'm going to close up now. I'm going to close up shop.
Okay. Well, we want to give her a big hand. That was